What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop podcast. At Whoop, we're on a mission to unlock human performance. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, the founder and CEO of Whoop. I hope everyone is having phenomenal holidays. Our last podcast was the Holiday Hacks, and this one is Whoop VP of Performance Science, Principal Scientist Kristen Holmes, being joined by Dr. Aric Prather. Aric is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. He co-directs the UCSF Aging, Metabolism, and Emotion Center, is the Interim Director for the UCSF Center for Health and Community, and serves as a clinician at the UCSF Insomnia Clinic. He is also the author of The Sleep Prescription, a book that offers a simple yet powerful plan to improve your sleep in just 7 days. How about that? Aric's research is regularly featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Today Show, and NPR. Kristen and Aric discuss Aric's research at the AME Center, how sleep is working with immune systems and vaccines, sleep impacting your metabolic health. Sleep can actually be a big help when it comes to losing weight. The link between time-restricted eating and sleep. Aric's book, The Sleep Prescription. He touches on the small behavioral changes that can impact your sleep, mental health, and energy levels, and myths around sleep and stress. This is a timely podcast. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us podcast@whoop.com, call us 508-443-4952. Without further ado, here are Kristen Holmes and Dr. Aric Prather.
Dr. Aric Prather is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. Aric's research program focuses on the causes and consequences of insufficient sleep, with particular interest on how poor sleep impairs mental and physical health, including immunity and heart health. His research has been supported continuously by the National Institute of Health and spans large-scale analysis of populations down to laboratory-based experiments and everything in between. You will learn more about his research throughout our conversation today, but you can also pick up his amazing book, The Sleep Prescription, and learn how to improve your sleep in just 7 days. Aric, I think a great place to start would be to understand a little bit more about your research and what you've discovered over the years and how that's informed your clinical practice.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for kind of letting me have this conversation with you. I'm really excited about it. So the AME Center, so that's the Aging, Metabolism, and Emotion Center here at UCSF, and so I co-direct it with Dr. Alyssa Eppel, and we've been kind of close colleagues and friends for gosh, before I even went to graduate school. She had just finished her postdoctoral fellowship at UCSF, and so it's been so wonderful to come back here. I mean, I've come back here. I've been here for over a decade now, but and the work that we do together really focuses on kind of this interplay between kind of stress and emotion, and I really dig deep on the sleep piece that makes up kind of our lives, right? And we know that these things interact with one another and have kind of deep and profound impacts on our biology. And so we're always trying to unpack that, whether it's metabolism or aging biomarkers or mental health outcomes. I've really focused in on the sleep piece because of kind of all that we know about how it really. I think of it as kind of the glue that holds our life together, right? And we know that intuitively, but it also seems to have such an important regulatory role on various biological processes, right? So my training is in graduate school and going forward has been in psychoneuroimmunology. So really focusing in on how these behavioral or psychological or social factors drive variation in immune outcomes. And it turns out that sleep just plays such a fundamental role in that. And so I've had really great collaborations and opportunities to be able to really dig into what are those clinical outcomes, whether it be vaccination or susceptibility to kind of the common cold if people are exposed. All of those are clearly linked to the sleep that we get. And I think the important thing about that, like one, it's important on its own, like to verify this in the research, but we know how to intervene on sleep, right? It's one of those things that we have a really great toolbox to get people sleeping better. And now we have shown that it makes a big impact on their health. And for me, that's really a passion.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I mean, there's no question. Sleep is just absolutely foundational, as you point out. Just impacts every aspect of our lives. And when you talk about it from an immune standpoint, can what have you really found in your research in terms of how sleep impacts immune function and just our ability to be resilient to various diseases? How we accept vaccine, for example, I think is another area that you've looked into.
So, I mean, like this work has, really developed in kind of the animal research and then had been kind of carried forward in experimental studies in humans. And we see that, both sleep and circadian factors contribute independently to kind of the number and the function of various kind of cells and subtypes that have relevance to how we protect ourselves against viruses and have been linked to things like chronic disease conditions like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, those sorts of things. And that's really kind of the role of inflammation, and we've done a lot of work on that. In general, what we and others have found is, on the inflammation side and this chronic disease condition side, is that when people get insufficient amounts of sleep, so that can be kind of typically less than 7 hours on average for an adult, that puts people at risk for elevation in kind of inflammatory biomarkers like, pro-inflammatory markers like interleukin 6 and C-reactive protein, which are, on the pathway to a variety of age-related conditions. And then where we've probably really dug deep in our group has been in the context of infectious illness. So we've done this in two primary ways. So in collaboration with Sheldon Cohen at the Carnegie Mellon University, who's kind of world famous for doing these cold exposure studies, we were able to bring in a group of people, around 160 of them. They were all healthy. We measured their sleep kind of objectively using wrist actigraphy, so kind of like the Whoop, right? Just
Yeah.
ones that we do use in the laboratory, and measured it, got a good stable average, and then everyone was brought in and exposed to the same amount of live virus. In this case, it was the rhinovirus, and then they were quarantined to see who in fact got sick. And so, what fascinating to me is that, you give everybody rhinovirus or any virus and not everybody gets infected. It's a significant proportion, but not everybody. And then of those people, not everyone actually gets sick. And so we didn't want to rely on people's self-report about their symptoms and things like that. We measured it objectively, and so we did that in two ways. I mean, first we ensured that they were infected, and so every single person, we washed their nose every single day and then cultured the cells to see if the virus was replicating, and if it was, that they were infected. And then for symptoms, we actually collected all the tissues that they used throughout the day, kind of got them in a baggie, weighed them, and got an objective measure of mucus production. And then in a second step, had everybody every single day kind of put their head back, and we squirted a dye into their nose and then timed how long it took to get to the back of their throat. And the longer it takes, the more congested they were. So it was kind of a good measure of nasal congestion. So the combination of being infected and then meeting some thresholds on mucus production or a nasal congestion, those people were deemed to have a cold, to have a biologically verified cold. So it became, we do all of this work and then we just get this kind of yes no outcome, like you got a cold or you didn't. And what we found, and what has been really profound, and I think is kind of the strongest empirical evidence that we have that sleep plays such an important role in susceptibility to infectious illness, is that people that were shorter on sleep, particularly people who were getting 6 or fewer hours per night on average based on this wrist device, were about 4 times more likely to get a cold, to meet this threshold, than people who slept the recommended, right? So the 7 hours or more group, or the more than 7 hours group. And so, and again, everyone got exposed. It was like that was controlled, but sleep played such an important role. And then we, controlled for all of the important confounds that might also explain this. And it just was this independent effect that we've now kind of replicated with a larger set of data that just uses self-report sleep duration. And so we see that same thing, and we've seen it, time and time again in the population level epidemiology. And so this is some really clear evidence. Of course, we can't do that type of study over and over again, and it's and so and may not be as health relevant in kind of a policy setting. And so we've kind of moved since then into vaccinations, right? And that has been really clear too, at least in the work that we've done, that we've done it in the context of hepatitis B vaccination series. We've done it using the influenza vaccination series. And just most recently, Alyssa Epple and I have just closed our study looking at the COVID-19 vaccine. And in all instances, we found some signal that suggests that when people have shorter amounts of sleep or poorer sleep, they just don't mount the same level of responses that we think are critical to protect us from a virus if in fact we were exposed to it, right? So this has important, you know, policy implications, right? Like as far as the messaging, we've taken it a step further in the context of a study that we did in influenza, where we wanted to know, is there a particular day that matters when people get sleep, right? Like if we were going to try to help people understand, like obviously everyone should get as much sleep, that they need all the time, but like when we actually do vaccines and people are going to get that administration, is that something that we want to include in the messaging? And so in this one small study that certainly needs to be replicated, when people got the influenza vaccine, we looked at kind of how they slept on each night, kind of leading up to the vaccine and the nights after it. And in this case, we found that when people got more sleep the night before the vaccine or the night before that, that seemed to be a strong predictor of how they responded in the future with respect to their antibodies. So, if we're able to replicate that, maybe it is something that we can, consider in the messaging, that like, hey, you're getting a vaccine, try to get a good night's sleep. Obviously the message shouldn't be, if you don't get a good night's sleep, you shouldn't get the vaccine. So we need to be careful there. But certainly, it's a good place to really raise the profile of the importance of sleep for something that, since the pandemic, it's clear that this is going to be something that we face moving forward. And, the more that we can amplify the protecting signals that our immune system creates, the better.
One other thing I wanted to talk about is you're doing tons of work, the Consortium for Obesity Assessment, Study, and Treatment, also known as COAST. If you want to talk a little bit about that, because I think oftentimes folks don't associate the quality and sufficiency and consistency of their sleep with metabolic outcomes, but there's obviously clear mechanistic connections there, and would love for you to just dig in a little bit into kind of what you found with that study and how sleep can help folks manage their metabolic health more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, there's so Coast and the other groups, there's a nutrition center here at UCSF as well, and sleep is always been kind of a pillar for understanding those things, because we know from kind of lots of experimental literature that when we deprive people of sleep, it not only impacts directly our metabolism, and including things like insulin resistance and glucose regulation, but also kind of appetite hormones like ghrelin and leptin, and shift us towards a kind of a phenotype where we may have, increased hunger just because of, and I think there's a really kind of elegant study that was done several years ago where they, really controlled all aspects of the environment and people's kind of sleep and light exposure, and found that, because there was always this concern that, well, yeah, we know that when people don't sleep enough, like they eat more or they gain weight. Is it really, I mean, your body's up longer, like is it just about kind of maintaining alertness and metabolic demand because of this prolonged wakefulness? And it turns out that kind of when you control all of those things, that's not the case, that people will still eat more than their body requires. I think one of my most favorite studies is one done by Benedict and colleagues in Europe, where they actually built a grocery store and they deprive people of sleep. And so, because it was more than like, oh, people have these preferences, do they really have these
Mhm.
behaviors? And they were given a set amount of money and they filled up their grocery cart, and it was just like overflowing with like high caloric foods. It was like, oh my gosh, if given the chance, you would do that. And we all know that experience, right? Like,
Totally.
you've had a crummy day and you're like, oh, I'm gonna have that salad for lunch. You're like, well, but I don't know. I deserve the pizza today. I mean, it's been a tough day. And that's like embedded in our biology. And you see the same sort of thing with, I mean, and I don't know when Alyssa was on, like, it's the same thing with stress, right? And so, insufficient sleep and stress have kind of a lot of the same underlying biology. And so, there's this kind of need to kind of, it's possible that some of this is due to the stress response, that you're really trying to dampen that down because of the insufficient sleep. And so, we've kind of, been looking at these sorts of things both, in different studies of like interventions, so like meditation trials and things like that, and the role of sleep as like a moderator. Does that impact how people kind of do, improve in kind of weight outcomes or metabolic outcomes? We did a really interesting study just using epidemiologic data of, tens of thousands of people, and found that, people that were short on sleep were much more likely to consume high amounts of sugar sweetened beverages. And, so trying to understand these links and what they might mean in the long term for people's health. But, I mean, there is just like a whole lot of work there. And we do know that, when people go long periods without sleep, say chronic insufficient sleep, kind of they do put on the pounds. And it's not just a lack of willpower, right? There's like something happening below the surface that, you know, pushes you towards kind of this more obesogenic status. And again underscores the importance of like why sleep should be a target, because it can have a, and I mean, the last thing I'll say, I mean, just about that is, one of the other things in the sleep world that really matters is obstructive sleep apnea, right? So this is a condition in where, that is, very prominent, and it increases with age, and it is kind of the tendency to kind of stop breathing, to have, occlusions in your respiration during the night, right? And that causes sleep fragmentation, that causes kind of sympathetic nervous system like surges, and increases in cardiovascular, outcomes like blood pressure and all these other things. And it happens much more frequently with weight gain, right? So it's not just that sleep contributes to weight gain. Kind of the weight gain in turn can then lead to these sleep disorders that thankfully we do have some treatments for, but it becomes this cycle, right? And we know that when people have obstructive sleep apnea, probably because of the insufficient amounts of sleep that they're often getting, it's really hard to lose that weight, right? So then, we really, it's complex, but we do know that sleep in a lot of times is the linchpin for some of these things.
So if we're just up for more hours in the day than what's typical, that is, we're not getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep. So in theory, we're up longer, we're eating more calories. Have you found in your research, or have you seen in any other research, where folks end up biasing their calories toward closer to when they sleep? Just we know, of
Mm.
course, glucose tolerance is higher earlier in the day than later in the
Hmm.
day. So in my view, or in what I've seen in our data, millions of sleeps, lots of logging food and the timing of food. I'm very, very, of course, interested in the temporal aspect of things, because I think that there is a knowing what we know about metabolism, and when we're primed to kind of digest and metabolize food, we know that we're better at it earlier in the day, like closer to
Yeah.
when we wake up, we're going to be more able to deal with food, and we've evolved to digest during the day, not during the night. So once the sun goes down, we're not as we're more
Yep.
insulin resistant. So I
Yep.
guess I'm wondering, to what degree have you do you know, I guess this concept of time restricted eating, we could talk about it through that lens, but is that an intervention that you deploy in your clinic to kind of help people, number one, sleep better, right? It's hard to digest and sleep at the same time, right? We know that. So,
Yeah.
and just we know that glucose tolerance is lower later in the day. So,
Yeah.
given those two kind of profound things, like how much do you promote these kind of restricted eating windows that are
Yeah.
get us away from
I mean,
the calming
I
sleep.
I mean, I love this question. I mean, it is absolutely, you know, I feel like every week there's like a high impact
Mm,
study on this topic in a
yeah.
very variety of domains. And I sit on, grant review panels for the
Mm,
National Institute of Health. And I have been struck by how many groups are interested in this topic and the level of evidence that
mm,
is already accrued. So it does seem that, and it's usually been in the context of like time restricted eating, right? Like
yeah.
it's usually an 8 hour window, and it's usually
Hmm.
like 11 to 7 or 12 to
Mm,
8 or,
hmm.
10 to 5 or 10 to 6, or it is striking how effective it seems to be for improving metabolism
Mm.
and maybe as a consequence sleep. In our
Our
clinic,
data is
it
wild.
yeah, I bet. I wanna
Wild.
see it. I wanna hear
I
about it.
know.
Like, it's
We're about
like
to launch the largest time restricted eating study ever done
that's amazing. That's
tomorrow.
amazing.
Yeah,
That's exciting.
I know.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so, it it it's definitely, I think this area of kind of like chronomedicine and, as a related thing, time restricted eating, I think has a lot of legs, and I'm like really excited to see how it goes with respect to sleep. I mean, and in our clinic and in our practice, I mean, we it's primarily focused on insomnia, and so you know certainly trying to regulate people's eating times and keep them consistent and ideally not too close to the time that they want to go to bed is important. And, if people are kind of have wildly shifting eating times, then we'll kind of use that in part because of the role that eating has in regulating your circadian rhythm. So kind of as a Zeitgeber, or helping to entrain the rhythm. And so we do that, and then kind of the types of foods that people eat. I mean, the general idea is that, like, obviously not something too heavy, too spicy. We don't want to kind of disrupt people's sleep in that way. But you raise kind of, I think there's a lot. Like, I have a colleague here who is in private practice that is a insomnia researcher, but also like really heavily involved in like kind of lifestyle medicine. And I've been really intrigued in kind of her recommendations. And some of it is we think it works, but we're not sure. But, like, it's probably not going to hurt. Those sorts of things. But I mean, I do think there's a place for some of these things, and I think we need more data
Hmm.
to, at least as like a provider,
Of
to
course.
before the level of evidence before
Start
we start
prescribing.
recommending. Yeah, yeah. But I mean,
Mm,
it is interesting. And again, this idea of this interplay between sleep and circadian science is, there are probably so many sorts of things that will enhance our overall
mm.
health and well-being once we kind of marry those things more carefully and thoughtfully. So that's really exciting. I'm excited to hear how it goes.
Yeah, yeah. I'm excited to share. It'll be really cool to see the data. It's been a kind of a long time coming. We kind of, obviously are sitting on loads and loads of data, and we have lots of journal data, so we kind of know when people are they log when they're eating their meals. So just looking at those
Yeah,
data, this isn't controlled, right? This is just kind of in the wild, and this next study is going to be controlled based on kind of those initial findings. But
like a
there's
randomized study.
yeah,
Oh, awesome.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
So it's a bit randomized controlled trial. But
Amazing.
what's really interesting in the data is, we're able to we see when folks log report eating meals 2 hours prior to bed or within 2 hours of when they intend to sleep, we see drastic reductions in markers of sleep and recovery on par to
Yeah.
alcohol. So same sort of, like
Yeah.
alcohol is the big, needle mover, when
Oh my
folks report
gosh.
drinking alcohol. Yeah, it's just massive.
Every single time.
Yeah, every single time. Like there's no getting away from it. But food seems to have kind of a similar impact. So yeah, I think it's worthwhile to kind of dig into it further just to see exactly what's
Yeah.
happening and if certain windows are better than others and et cetera. So I think to your point, there's a
Yeah.
lot to I think still learn. Your book is
Yeah.
so beautiful, the sleep
Oh.
prescription, and
Oh, thanks.
it's a practical guide to getting. I love how I forget who said this, and maybe it's just the way that the book is described, but getting out of your own way and changing your
Yeah.
behaviors to set yourself up for a better night's sleep. So we talked about, sleep and immunity, sleep and metabolic health. Obviously, sleep impacts your cardiovascular health. Sleep is going to impact your how you manage and think about stress during the day. Based on you've just got all this clinical experience, all this research experience. Number one, what led you to write this book? If you can just kind of outline what this like optimal prescription is to help people get on the right track to getting the best night's sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I was really fortunate to be able to do this, and I love talking about sleep. I like him like all in on this, and I
Yeah,
wasn't always this way. I don't know. It just over time, I just became so convinced that it was such a I mean, some of it's just like selfish. Like I love how I feel when I help someone, and it just has such a profound effect.
it
It really
does.
is. Like so I'm a licensed clinical psychologist but I would, I've always done mostly research, like almost 100% research. And I wasn't even sure I would ever get licensed. And then when I was on clinical internship, which was you have to do like before you finish graduate school, I did it at Duke University. And for this internship, and I got trained in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia by kind of one of the leaders in the field, Jack Ettinger. And I was like, wow. I mean, if I ever get licensed, this is all I'm gonna do because it's like it's behavioral, it's like it's time limited, and it's like so effective. And so, in doing it over these number of years in our clinic, I was like, but our wait list is so long. It's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people long, and it's they're on the wait list for like 6 months, and there's just no way. We need to scale this, and lots of people are talking about how to scale this, and there's lots of ways to do it, and so then just by happenstance, Alyssa Epple had like signed on to do a book. So this, the sleep prescription is part of a series, right? So she wrote the stress prescription, and then
Mhm.
the John and Julie Gottman, who are like world famous, super famous relationship researchers, wrote the love
Yeah.
prescription. And so they were looking for someone to do the sleep one, and like my office is just down the row from Alyssa, and we're so close. She's like, well, I know someone. I was like, oh my gosh, like this could be the way to try to reach more people, and so like I was really fortunate, and the goal was to kind of just distill the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, for kind of just for the general public, right? Because I think, though it is not a substitute for that, like that is a very clear, empirically supported treatment. The principles that that create that program are based in sleep science, right? And kind of psychotherapy and psychology. And so, it seemed like this was an opportunity to do that. And I also think, the premise of this particular book is that we spend a lot of time when people have trouble sleeping, they spend a lot of time worrying about their sleep. They spend a lot of time planning. They spend a lot of time, like a lot of effort that goes into kind of the hours just leading up to sleep, right? But in fact, the best opportunity to improve your sleep like begins as soon as you wake up. And so the idea is that like, you can do things, be intentional over time, like from the moment you wake up to put yourself in the best position. And then the other piece of it is like, and this is true for cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia or CBTI as well, is like the real goal is to get people to like not worry about their sleep, right? Like you can never promise that tonight's going to be perfect, right? Like when you start going down that road, you've usually lost because that effort, that distress, that thinking, that worry about how do I make my night like the best night I can have gets in the way of our ability to sleep well. I say that like, most people never even wonder how sleep works until it stops working. And then when it stops working, they get like super focused on like, how do I make this happen? But sleep is not something that we make happen. Sleep is something that happens to us, right? It like kind of washes over us. But, because it's adaptive to be able to kind of not sleep, right? Like ask any parent, ask anybody that's been in any kind of emergency situation. we can override those sleep signals with our worry, with our anxiety, with our distress, with our behaviors. And so, this book and CBTI is really about like, how do we structure your sleep experience, starting when you wake up, to take the effort out of it, take the thinking out of it, like let it do what your body is like built to do, which is to sleep, right? And so in doing so, we start with kind of like, I mean, just like I do in clinic, like if we could change one thing, it's like start to stabilize your wake up time,
Mm,
right? And that's based so clearly in what we know about sleep science. So and circadian science. So it's like,
mhm,
setting a stable wake up time kind of helps entrain your circadian rhythm,
mhm,
right? Ideally you get some sunlight exposure right as soon as you wake up, and then
mhm,
you can kind of shut down that melatonin system,
mhm,
and it turns out that like just our body works so much better
mhm.
when things are predictable.
Would you say that it's more important so, this is what I see in the
Yeah.
data that it seems
Yeah.
that sleep-wake time, no question, if that's consistent, it trumps duration. We see
Mm.
independent effects. The more stable your sleep-wake time, it almost you need to spend the requisite time in bed, but if you can stabilize sleep-wake time, your markers of recovery, and your psychological functioning. So we do lots of subjective measures, kind of running alongside the physiological data that
Yeah.
and we see no question that workplace resilience, psychological functioning, all these markers of resilience improve physiological and psychological when we have stable sleep wake times. So onset does matter, but I think to your point, offset really, really matters. So
Yeah.
would you say if a person's prioritizing or trying to, figure out, okay, do I try to sleep in on Saturday morning, or do I just, wake up at my usual time? And you're
Yeah.
saying that, hey, waking up at your usual time is actually going to be better than extending
Yeah.
sleep.
Well, so yeah, I mean, so yes, that I do make that case that, waking up at the same time each day is kind of like the one, but also it's like about control. Like you can control that, right? We can't control when we fall asleep. I mean, the good news is that if
Totally.
you maintain a stable wake time because of the second thing that regulates your sleep, which is like our homeostatic sleep drive, our days aren't that different from one another. Like the energy
Right.
we expend, like it just isn't. And so you'll start to get sleepy around the same time each day because like, we're awake for a certain amount of time because we're humans, right? And that varies, right? Like,
Right.
it is not one size fits all, though most people it's like around 7, 8 hours, 7, 9 hours, but for the sleep need. So that is true. I guess around the sleeping in thing, I try to take like a more gentle approach around that because these recommendations are for people that want to sleep better, right? Like I think as a rule, and the data is accruing that when people have this kind of social jet lag, this like waking up, getting less sleep and then sleeping in on the weekend, that does seem to have independent metabolic and long-term health effects,
Mhm.
that we're still
Huge
trying to.
mental health effects.
Yeah, and yeah, sure. And I mean it
Yeah.
but it's is it like, so the mental health effects are interesting. I like wonder what your thoughts are on this. I guess my first guess would be it's not about the shift, it's about because the reason that they need to do the shift. Like it's like, and so when I think about like, people that have these big swings, sometimes it's like, okay, yeah, you're having to sleep in on the weekend, but like, isn't that maybe a symptom of like what's going on in the week? Like where, like what is this that
Yeah.
like you're not getting this sleep? Like what is else is going on in your life that's like structuring it in a way that you feel so compelled, or your body feels so compelled to try to make up this amount? You know what I mean? Like and so I wonder if that is versus the actual like physiologic outcome of shifting,
Mm.
right? And like maybe it's somewhere in
It's a
between,
combination
and
for sure.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the point I was trying to make was that like, if people like, I never want to be say like, no, you can't sleep in on the weekend anymore. Sorry, I'm like the fun police, and it's like,
Yeah.
sorry, this is your life now. It's like, but if you're trying to improve your sleep, like if there's something that you perceive as wrong, or you're not feeling good during the day, you don't feel like you're kind of optimized, or what have you, like this is something you can do, right? Like this is a very clear, concrete thing that you can control, and and then it's like up to you. Like this is the information I'm giving you. Like we know that this works, and where do you, where are you on kind of the behavior change journey to like take it up, right? And maybe there are things that like maybe are will be more or less motivating for you, but and then this is where we get into like, what are the kind of motivators or reward systems that we can put in place to get people to do it more often, right? So we always like I always talk about like tying kind of the awakening to something that you find pleasant, right? So it's like, whether it's like,
Cup
here
of
in San
coffee.
Francisco, it's like, yeah, coffee,
Mm,
or like, like if if you have a family, like that time alone by yourself, like
yeah.
before everyone else is up, like that's like a really special time for some people. I mean, certainly for me, I've gotten really into sunrises, like it's like
Good.
just so I can have that time. So,
Same.
but I mean, and that is just but it also has like such a clear kind of physiologic impact on like how your day and sleep is regulated, and so that's such a great place to start. And
Yeah, I
then
love that.
yeah, and then throughout the day there are things we can do too. I mean, and a lot of it is like around like stress management
Yeah.
and ensuring that you're kind to yourself, right? And like because oftentimes the world is not right. Like there's a lot of demands, there's lots of pressures, there's and everyone I like to think is like doing their best, and like they're not trying to make people feel that pressure like in their jobs and stuff like that, but like everyone has their thing, and so just but being intentional about say taking breaks, doing meditation, ensuring scheduling out time for worrying, right, so that it doesn't seep into your night. So we always do like a worry time exercise
Oh, I
where
love
people
that.
kind of like break out and say for 20 minutes like write down all the things that they're worried about or talk it out. Or I mean, one, it's like taking a break but being active and intentional. But also in the middle of the night we find that like people can kind of have a shift in their thinking and say like, no, I already worried about this today and I have it scheduled for tomorrow. Like I can do this when I'm more kind of feeling at my best. And just that practice helps people kind of shut it off, right? To like allow themselves to drift back to sleep. And so those are day things, but I'll stop there.
No, it's amazing. So stabilizing kind of that wake up time, being as consistent as possible, viewing sunlight in the morning, and then love, this concept of managing stress throughout the day. Because invariably, if we're not proactive in managing the stress, that's going to seep into our sleep onset latency. It's going to impact our sleep onset latency. It's going to impact our ability to fall asleep and stay asleep. So I love this idea of the worry time. Would you say, as a clinical psychologist, like to what degree do we need to label that worry? Like how beneficial is labeling the worry to kind of mitigate or manage stress?
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so there's like a whole set of kind of interventions that are around affect labeling. And I think there is something about around language and defining things. I mean, oftentimes, for many of us, like myself included at times, like I'm just not particularly insightful about how I'm feeling, right? Like I'm just like I feel bad, and like and that's hard to be actionable, hard, like to be action oriented or to identify and let something go when you don't have a name for it. And so I do think there is something to, putting in some of the work to kind of be like, what is it that's making me feel this way? Or like, what am I really worried about? Because in some cases, like these worries though are real, like they're maybe they're big or they're amorphous and you just can't get a hold of it, but the feelings is still there and it's still real. So the more you can give it shape, the more you can name it. Maybe there is a solution, or maybe you take a step back and you're like, oh well, like now that I've like really broken it down, it's it's not something that I should be so worked up about. I mean, I think there's lots of different outcomes that can come from it. But I do think actually the naming can be really helpful. And this is why, when I recommend this strategy, I do find that kind of writing it down so that you can visually see it and track it helps people kind of, find the thread of logic or illogic in that, and then, you can also like come back to it and potentially come up with other solutions or reflect on it. You know what I mean? So I
For
think
sure.
that is helpful.
Yeah, I find that to be one of the most powerful interventions for
Hmm,
for helping my own sleep. And
yeah.
we developed a feature that is available to our members. It's called the Stress Monitor, and it basically just monitors your stress throughout the day, and it
Yeah.
maps it on a scale of 0 to 3. And our
Yeah.
algorithm is basically looking at real-time heart rate variability and heart rate.
Yeah.
And the algorithm, and it basically just kind of maps your whole entire, like, 24 hours, and you can kind of see your stress during sleep, you can see your stress during the day, and it doesn't account for, of course, your activity stress, although we do show you when you're engaging in a high cardiovascular activity, like, running or
Yeah.
whatever. But what's really interesting is when I notice I'm spending, it has my baseline, so how I typically respond and react to stress throughout the day. And when I'm above my threshold, that is, I'm in kind of a high stress zone relative to my baseline, I know that even though I wasn't, like, consciously aware that I was in this high stress zone, the monitor will alert me that I was in this high stress zone for longer than I typically am. So, and that's when I sit down, I'm like, okay, like, I reflect on my day, and I write about it, and I label those emotions, and I invariably, like, I know when I actually go through that and proactively, reflect on my day and my stress, and I journal a bit, there's no question my sleep is better for it. So I do
Yeah.
think there's something about understanding our stress and not being afraid of our stress, but
Yeah.
having tools and strategies to manage it proactively, I think gives us such a high degree of agency, and I think it's the agency that impacts our sleep in a lot of ways. Just feeling like you have some sort of strategy, even though you're not resolving everything in that moment where you're journaling, for example, but I think that agency does bleed into feeling, a higher degree of control, which I think invariably is gonna help us fall asleep and have a better night's sleep, um,
Yeah. No,
but
that's
yeah.
really interesting, and that sounds really promising.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that yeah, I'd love for us to dig into that stress monitor data together,
Yeah.
and see the relationships between kind of sleep, stress during the
Yeah.
day and how that manifests in sleep, and yeah, and then, there, obviously we see, alcohol, for example, the stress monitoring sleep is just off the charts.
Yeah.
So I'd love to just kind of shift a little bit and talk. I know
Oh,
we've
yeah.
only got a few minutes,
Sure.
but debunking
Sure.
some of the sleep myths, and just
Yeah.
pressing into some of the behaviors that we know really do impact sleep. All right, so people often think that insomnia and sleeping less is kind of the only issue, but actually sleeping longer can really impact folks. So, I
Yeah.
think you'd probably say that there's some sort of sweet spot. But
Yeah.
what do you know about really long sleeps, and how does that
Yeah.
actually impact, mentally, or, mental and physical and emotional well-being?
Yeah, long sleep has such a interesting history, and it comes up all the time. If you look in the epidemiologic literature, you regularly see this U-shaped relationship between sleep and whatever outcome you're interested in. That, like, short sleep, which we focus on a lot,
Right.
is related, but this long sleep, say, like sleeping, in some cases it's like sleeping more than 9 hours, sometimes it's sleeping more than 10 hours, depending on the study, is also associated with kind of increased risk for kind of a whole host of outcomes. I mean, I think the strongest is in the kind of like physical health outcome type thing, but I mean, I'll talk about that in a second. That we honestly don't have a great understanding of, like, why this is, like, why there is this strong relationship. And so historically, the thought has been like, well, it could be one of two things: that it's that people that are long sleepers are actually ill, right? That it's like there is some underlying illness that is making them sleep longer, right? Because, as take anybody that's had a cold, a bad cold or something like that. Like, our sleep has changed in lots of ways, but oftentimes it's like you don't want to get up. You, like, you might be in and out of sleep, and it won't be the most restful or robust sleep, but it's like, your body's recovering. And so maybe that's why we see this relationship between long sleep and negative health outcomes, because they were sick already and we didn't know. And that this is just going along with that. The other most common explanation is that it might be something about depression, right? That, like, there are subtypes of depression, or kind of, characteristics of people that are depressed that sometimes include hypersomnia, or, like, sleeping excessively long, or we also think that, maybe people aren't sleeping per se, but they're just in bed for a long time and can't discern, like, if they're sleeping or not. But, like, and so it's and those that depression is kind of well known to be associated with, like, lots of negative health outcomes too, physical health outcomes. And so, maybe that is helping to explain this long sleep duration. But I mean, given to the mental health piece, right? Like, yes, like people that are depressed can spend a lot of time in bed. They may have less motivation. They may kind of, catch sleep more throughout the day, throughout the night. It's probably more fragmented, right? We do know, I mean, this is how CBTI often works, is that we kind of restrict people's time in bed, and that creates a more robust and efficient sleep, even though they might be getting less than they think they need. But just the fact that people are getting kind of this like kind of big bolus of sleep, it makes people feel better, it can improve their mood, all of those sorts of things. And so those two potential explanations have not been, necessarily proven, right? I mean, they're kind of like, post hoc, like, why do we see this? But it is consistent, like that this long sleep duration can be associated with negative outcomes. So I mean, I guess we can only make so much sleep, right?
Right.
So that's the thing. Like we can only make so
Yeah.
much. And but you can structure it in a way that it can take up a lot of time.
Hmm.
But ultimately it will lead to, when you give yourself like a huge window for sleep, it will create this experience of like little bouts of sleep, like
Right.
in and out. And people's subjective experience is such that it just doesn't feel good. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
feel restorative.
One of the things I'm really interested in is, is there a way to, by looking at sleep architecture, a way to predict uh, depression? So
Oh my gosh.
I
So
yeah,
interesting.
I know. I shorten REM latency and increased REM density, and increased total REM duration, are I think regarded as biological markers of depression. And I feel like, if we can if we can use, a Whoop device, for example, and be able to kind of understand, how quickly folks are dropping into to REM, I feel like that would give us a really nice picture of someone's like overall like mental health resilience. And as a way, if it's when it's becomes shorter and shorter, we would imagine that, people are, struggling more, right? So you can
Yeah.
almost get ahead of it before you get to a point where you're fully depressed, right? Like you can kind of like, hey, things are going a little south, like let's intervene before it's, you're in a clinical situation.
Yeah, I mean, like, so I think that's one of the areas that, is ripe for kind of
Mm,
innovation in the sleep
totally.
space and sleep and
Mm,
mental health space. I mean, I think there are challenges, obviously, that like, depression is a syndrome, right?
mm,
So it's not like one thing, and so that makes it a little bit harder.
of course.
And then sleep, I think my experience has been that there is so much in those signals, like this, that they're like signal processors and machine learning and all of these things that can be done
Mm,
to try to take advantage of the depth of information that you get, say in a
mm,
in a home sleep study or in
mhm,
an in lab sleep study, that maybe at some day can be kind of harnessed by wearable devices like the Whoop. I mean, that's
mhm,
such an exciting kind of avenue. But I mean, even if we just, if we start at like the gold standard of measurement, which is, like polysomnography,
mhm,
EEG measurement, um, we've just like scratched the surface in like what is done with those signals. Like, I mean, so I didn't train as like a sleep physiologist or anything like that. So like I pick it up as I go along, and I was like shocked that the sleep scoring system currently, like for REM or slow, N3 or N1 or
mm,
N2, all
mhm.
these sleep stages, is like if you have 50% or more of one, you get labeled that. And I'm like, that seems crazy. But like from a clinical standpoint, like that, I get that probably is sufficient, but not from a discovery standpoint,
No,
right? Like
I
this is where like
completely agree.
spectral analysis is so much stronger, and
Mhm,
whatever comes after that. And I'm excited to work with the like signal process people that like,
mm,
so we can begin to understand that. And the national the NIH has, created a national sleep research database where people have to dump in all of their sleep studies. And I think like, wow, like maybe that is where we can begin to do that. And
yeah.
there are definitely groups that are doing it. So it's really exciting.
Yeah. I love that you're thinking about it, too. This is
Yeah.
really it's amazing. Marijuana before bed.
Gosh, one of the most common things that people ask
Yeah,
about. We don't have a good handle
yeah.
on its efficacy. I think
Mm,
this is another area where like probably in the next 5 years, this will become, a little bit, particularly if federally
Mm.
it becomes available and legal, because, there the primary funding agency has for this type of work, for sleep work, has been kind of the National Institute of Health, but
Mhm.
they don't regularly fund this kind of work because it's not federally legal.
Mhm.
And so, historically it's been, you know, companies that have a formulation that they want to test. But then, and there is some data out of Australia that shows that, at least in their formulation of THC and CBD, that it did seem to improve insomnia symptoms compared to a
Mhm.
placebo. I mean, the placebo is hard to figure out, right? Like, what would be a good placebo for this?
Mhm.
But, what happens is, like, then this, but then can people get that formulation? Like, now we
Mhm.
have one empirically defined,
Yeah.
uh, and so it's just not regulated in that way. But there's, I guess my perspective is that, marijuana is no different as a sleep aid, as like taking a medication or taking Advil PM, because
Right.
what happens is, like, psychologically you become dependent upon it.
Mhm.
And so my perspective is that, like, for most people, maybe we can find a way to get people sleeping well without those types of aids, whether it be Advil PM or Benadryl or Ambien or marijuana, right? I mean, I think, for, specifically scientifically, there's lots of things that are interesting about trying to understand the endocannabinoid system in the brain, and like how that plays a role in sleep regulation, because, enough people take it that, I mean, it probably does do something. But, can we do it in a standardized way? And, it may ultimately be, an avenue for helping people sleep better if, other things fail, like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia or what have you. But, we're kind of handcuffed currently on not having enough data or in kind of empirical evidence to make any kind of recommendation if it came to that point, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, I mean, that is a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it'd be interesting to just kind of see where the research goes there. I know Dr. Amen, Daniel Amen. I don't know if you follow him at all, but he's a brain scientist, does all of these, like, imaging of the brain, and is kind of looking at the brain on alcohol, brain on
Yeah,
marijuana, and just
cool.
kind of understanding what's actually happening in the brain when we're ingesting these different substances. And
Yeah.
it's pretty compelling. It seems that marijuana, probably not surprisingly, seems to have a pretty negative impact on the brain, because I think it cuts off blood flow and oxygen to the brain at different points, so it
Mm,
has this kind of
that's not
secondary
good.
effect that's, yeah, not that great. But I think to your point, it's understanding the cost and the opportunity.
Yeah.
If marijuana is helping us, get to sleep, and we're kind of recouping and recovering, but there's maybe some impact on the brain. It's hard
Right.
to
I mean,
know, right?
you
Like,
make the
there's
same,
it's
you can
so
make the same case for
complicated.
like Ambien, right? Or Zolpidem, right?
Totally.
Like, I mean, it's the
Yeah.
same. And like, I think about this all the time. I mean, now, there's accruing evidence that suggests this association between, like, long-term use of those types of substances
Mhm.
and kind of, brain health, right? And so then you're like, well, maybe it's not, like, you're getting sleep, but like it's at a cost, right? And the
Right.
cost might be really big. But then the question is like, well, what if they didn't take anything and they didn't sleep at all those years? Like, would it be this, and I think it's
Right.
really, this is where I think, these behavioral treatments that we know are effective are so important, because
Mhm.
they don't carry this risk, right? And that's
Absolutely.
why I like it, feel so adamant about it. But, I get it, right? Like, it's like, people are just, they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
Often
exactly.
providers don't know any different, or they don't have access, and it's like there's all these opportunities to improve the sleep health of populations at
Mhm.
various levels, whether it's like at medical education,
Mhm.
or, in the primary care setting, or research, or, policies that help
Mhm.
protect people's sleep. All
Right.
of these things can be done, and we'll all be better off for it.
Yeah. So much work to be done. Um,
Job
uh,
security.
yes. What are you obsessing over right now?
Oh gosh. I am really obsessing over, um I'm really interested in, trying to understand biometric data that we collect, and how that's related to, daytime functioning. So, sleep and stress, like we talked about. I'm also really focused on, we just put in a project to look at sleep in the context of lung transplant. right? So I'm like working with a lung transplant doc, and one of the things that's so interesting because like lung transplant, people that get these have to take um, things to protect the immune system from rejecting the organ. And at least in our preliminary data, we find this really strong relationship between people's sleep disturbances after they get a lung transplant, and people that have more sleep disturbances are at significant increased risk of having this rejection. And so,
Yeah.
because I'm interested in sleep and the immune system, it's just,
Mm.
one, we can probably improve on people's sleep and that will, keep them alive longer. But, trying to understand what's going on there is kind of compelling. And so,
Yeah.
you could look in lots of different conditions, but I just happen to have a friend who's a lung transplant surgeon. So we get to kind of do that work. So we just finished that. And then we have another project focused on insomnia and inflammation on the heart. So we know that there is, this link between insomnia and cardiovascular disease, but trying to understand how that relationship happens is not clear. And so working with some kind of radiologists that do kind of simultaneous like PET and MRI imaging, we're able to recruit people that have insomnia and they don't have cardiovascular disease. But despite that, they have this elevated level of like inflammation in the arterial walls, in the coronary arteries, that we can see on the image is just kind of like striking, right? It's like, and it raises the question of like, well, what if, how's that happening? So we do a lot of mechanistic work to try to understand, like, we think it's the sympathetic nervous system that is driving changes in the bone marrow that like make things more inflammatory. They get lodged in the heart. But what happens if we intervene on this? Like, can we reduce this early surrogate marker that will protect people in the long term? And so, I think there's so much interesting, important, like experimental and interventional work that can be done in both healthy people, like in this case of this cardiovascular disease, and then in folks that are kind of really, trying to kind of survive a major surgery. I mean, it brings up other things about like sleep in the hospital and sleep and all these other things that I think are
Yeah.
so,
Where you just
is a
are not
whole other,
recovering at all.
we could have a whole
Yeah.
other conversation about. But
Hmm.
so I think those are probably the things that come to mind right now. But I think that's probably because that's like what I'm like deep in right
Mm.
now.
I love it so much. That is all just it's such critical, it's
Yeah.
just important work.
Yeah.
Um, just the hospital, just thinking about chronomedicine too. Uh,
Oh yeah. Oh
it's
gosh.
just like, yeah, just as it
Yeah.
relates to just waking folks up in the hospital and just understanding like when
Yeah.
we're administering
Yeah.
medication and
Oh
yeah, no,
yeah. I mean, that's like a whole, like, such an amazing area of study.
yeah, but how it impacts sleep, and we notice in our data when folks are taking NSAIDs, so, and just reporting that they're taking kind of ibuprofen, and we see a 15% decrease in sleep efficiency.
Wow.
Yeah,
Huh.
it's
Interesting.
surprising, right?
Yeah, I mean,
It
I
seems so
mean,
benign, right? An NSAID.
well, I mean, I like maybe has something to do with. I mean, the immune system plays an important role in regulating sleep generally,
Mm,
right? Like not
mhm,
just when you're sick. And I
totally.
mean, maybe it's something like if you have a large enough sample to be able to look at those things, like maybe you begin to notice these differences. And so
Yeah,
that I think that's what is so cool about the scale and the strength of the work that you guys are doing
mhm,
to begin to uncover something that people are like, "What? That's weird." Like, why would
yeah,
But didn't think didn't have the capacity to look at it that way.
yeah, and I think it's something related with athletes, so, there's probably high degrees of, they're working out a lot, there's
Yeah,
high degrees of inflammation, so they're trying to, like,
yeah,
reduce the
sure,
inflammation, but I think it actually impacts sleep, so there's a second
totally,
order effect that
super
they're not
interesting.
recognizing. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I know you
Oh my
have to
god,
go.
so
I
awesome.
could just
I could
talk
do
to
this all
you.
day.
I
I know.
same. You're just I wish, there's so many questions I didn't get to, and just yeah,
Well,
but,
hopefully we can do this again or do it offline and like
I
keep it going. I would
for
love,
sure.
love, love, love to do that.
Thank you so much, Aric. This was
Yeah,
really
thank
wonderful.
you. So great to chat.
Big thank you to Dr. Aric Prather for sharing his vast knowledge of sleep, circadian rhythms, and stress. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop Podcast, please leave a rating or review. Please subscribe to the Whoop Podcast. You can check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us podcast@whoop.com. Call us 508-443-4952. and we'll answer your questions on a future episode. If you're thinking about joining Whoop, you can visit our website, sign up for a 30-day free trial membership, and take the first step to unlocking your own best performance today. New members can use the code WILL, W-I-L-L, to get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. And that's a wrap. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next week on the Whoop podcast. As always, stay healthy and stay in the green.